Everyone, and welcome. My name is David Reeploeg. I serve in a couple of capacities. One is Executive Director for Hanford Communities, which represents the local governments surrounding the Hanford site in the Tri-City area, as well as Vice President for Federal Programs for the Tri-City Development Council, or TRIDEC, which is the economic development organization, as well as the community reuse organization for the Tri-City area. It's great to have you all here to join us for this webinar, which I think will be a really interesting conversation about federal power purchase agreements. And I wanted to begin by just providing a little bit of background about why ECA is interested in this topic. And I believe most of our audience would know, but ECA is a national organization that represents local governments surrounding Department of Energy facilities, whether that's EM on the cleanup side, NNSA, national laboratories, represents the local elected officials from those communities. And over the course of many conversations that we've had, a lot of the ECA member communities have a deep background in nuclear energy and nuclear technology, and they're very excited and interested in opportunities associated with new nuclear development. But they've also identified that there have been some challenges with deployment of some of these new technologies. A lot of the communities are served by small public utility districts that frankly just do not always have the capacity to either make long-term capital investments that take sometimes several years or more to get any of that return on investment. And they have limited risk tolerance. And so there's been an identification of long-term power purchase agreements as a potential mechanism for these communities to help bring new energy projects online. While concurrently, if we were able to extend the federal government's authority to the Department of Energy to enter into longer-term power purchase agreements, then it would allow the Department of Energy to also partner with these communities and also to meet the federal government's own fairly aggressive decarbonization goals. And so there's a lot of interest in this topic. As some of us know, the Department of Defense is currently able to do these longer-term power purchase agreements, but that's the only federal agency for the most part right now. And so we're very pleased to be joined by a couple of folks who are very knowledgeable about this topic and will be providing us all with some additional information about power purchase agreements and specifically perhaps some of the ways that we might work towards extending that authority to the Department of Energy and potentially to some other agencies, talk about why they're important and a little bit more about just how they work. So to kick off, I'll just begin by introducing our two presenters. First, I'd like to introduce Brian Oakley. Brian is a director at Summit Consulting. He has over 30 years of experience in providing financial advisory services to federal, state, and local agencies. Brian is a registered municipal advisor principal and is a recognized subject matter expert in credit analysis and has advised on numerous corporate project finance and public finance loan transactions. Over the course of his career, Mr. Oakley has advised on over $50 billion in corporate and project finance loans and possesses in-depth hands-on experience of the unique challenges faced by federal lending programs. For Seth Kirshenberg has served as the Executive Director of the Energy Community Alliance for over 25 years. ECA is a national nonprofit organization of elected local government officials adjacent to nuclear facilities in the United States. He is also an attorney at Kutak Rock LLP, where he has worked on over $25 billion of structured finance transactions in the US and abroad, including those located on DOD, DOE, and other federal government facilities, international nuclear fuel storage facilities, and small modular reactors. He has published several books and articles, regularly speaks on renewable and advanced reactor energy development, environmental cleanup, spent nuclear fuel, public-private partnerships, public participation, brownfields, and reuse of federal facilities. He has participated on several national federal advisory committees and boards on International Atomic Energy Agency, US EPA, and US DOE issues, and has participated on several national initiatives, including those led by the Aspen Institute, Keystone Institute, and others around the areas of the environment, public-private partnerships, energy development, nuclear waste, spent nuclear fuel, and national defense. Brian and Seth together have written several publications for DOE Nuclear Energy Office on financing and developing small modular reactors. And they have recently published an article in the American Bar Association publication on how the administration can promote the development of clean energy projects. Further, last week, Seth co-authored a paper on the new cash payment policy under the Inflation Reduction Act that allows state, tribal, and local governments, along with nonprofits, to benefit from tax credits for clean energy projects through direct cash payments. And so before I hand it over to Seth and Brian, I just welcome everybody to ask any questions that you may have through the Q&A or the chat feature through the webinar, and we'll make sure that we have some time at the end to address as many questions as we can. And so with that, I will turn it over to Brian and Seth for the presentation.
Seth, are you sharing screen? There you go. All right. Why don't I start? So we're going to explore a few questions today. First, talk a little bit about what is a power purchase agreement, often just referred to as a PPA or an offtake agreement, and examine how it's particularly important to small modular reactors and renewable energy development projects. Oops. There you go. And in particular, how PPAs relate to financing and how they're facilitated by various legal authorities at the federal level. And all that helps inform how federal agencies can purchase power from an SMR or other clean energy facility, and in turn enable the development of these technologies to help meet public policy goals. And I guess we'll also look to projects that are actually on federal land, which introduces a host of other factors to consider. When we look at a power purchase agreement or PPA, really at the core, we're talking about a contractual arrangement for a quantity of electrons delivered over a period of time, usually a long term, at a specific price. Many large scale, utility scale, renewable energy projects in particular, and all sorts of others, have been developed sort of on the strength of the PPA arrangement. And it's really kind of essential to the financing because a power purchase agreement will mitigate the demand risk associated with the facility. And that's very critical to financing because a lender will look to the PPA, the terms of the PPA, and lend against that payment stream. And if you have a long-term PPA, that payment stream can be extended over a long period of time, and in turn lower the cost per electron of the power. In the context of federal agencies as purchasers, what we're really looking to do is leverage the purchasing power and the demand of the federal government in a way that will help facilitate the development of these projects. And so it really does seem to be a tool that could be deployed on a fairly large scale to affect policy objectives and targets. And we'll talk a little bit about budgeting, but kind of the way I kind of simplify this, I mean, we've got policy mandates for to address climate change and resilience goals. And currently with the Inflation Reduction Act and the infrastructure bill, there are a lot of incentives that are encourage this behavior, tax incentives, as well as other incentives like lending authorities that can help promote these projects. And at the same time, we have the federal government as a very large consumer of power. and those power needs are going to persist over a very long period of time. And so really the question is, why not harness this purchasing power in a way that will help facilitate these projects? And from a budgetary perspective, we'll talk a little bit about budget scoring, but at the end of the day, this is a cost that the government will shoulder over a long period of time. And while some of these projects may require a slight premium in cost, the cost will be there nonetheless. And so if the commitment to purchase power can be codified under contract, that in turn will help these projects develop and then in turn meet the targets, the climate targets and the clean energy targets that the administration has set out. Next slide. Great. What's interesting is, to date, if we look back now almost 20 years, the federal government's actually been very, very effective at encouraging the development of clean energy projects through incentives, and that includes tax incentives, credit incentives, or the loan program, as well as purchases. In the diagram to the right, we have the solar and wind generation in gigawatt hours from the point of the Energy Policy Act enactment in 2005 to, I guess it was through 2021. But you'll see, how that, the growth of the industry has really been mobilized through these incentives. And at the same time, the cost per unit output has become more and more competitive. So I think the track record to date is very good. It obviously takes a while for these projects to be developed. I can tell you that both the solar and wind projects in that were in development 2010 timeframe and beyond, all of those at the utility scale were really bankable because they had firm offtake contracts in the form of long-term PPAs, and the pricing under those PPAs was competitive because of the federal incentives, both ITC, PTC, depreciation, et cetera, et cetera. So when we see these incentives work together, they can be very powerful and really put clean sources of clean power at a very competitive position relative to traditional sources of power.
Right. And so, what's interesting is, so Brian and I, when we're approached and we start to look and think about projects, the first thing that people say, that they usually have a goal in mind. So years ago, the federal government approached us and said, I was working with the United States Department of Navy, and the Navy basically said, we, as the Navy, the administration at that time has said, we need to purchase more renewable energy and have more renewable energy on our projects. There was a 1 gigawatt challenge in order to do that. So they wanted to buy 1 gigawatt. That's a lot of power for their military bases. The bases all had power purchase agreements with private local utilities. They were buying all sorts of mix of power at the time. And so there was a study done to say, okay, where are we getting our power at these particular bases? And don't forget, the administration at that time was really trying to push out renewable energy. And so when we started to look and we started to understand, at that time, the Department of Defense really only thought that they had a 10-year authority. And if you look, the second line item, it's called Power Purchase Agreements, GSA Authority, 40 USC 501, Part 41, up to 10 years. That is basically the authority that almost every federal agency uses to buy power. And the developers were saying, that's great that you have 10-year authority. I am not going to build you a renewable power source unless you tell me you're going to be buying this for 15, 20 years, because I got to finance this thing. And if you want it to be a certain affordable rate, that you're buying power, because the federal government doesn't buy a project in those cases. What they're doing is they're buying the power that's delivered to them. And the power costs that they were paying at the time were set at a particular rate. And so the contracting officer said, I can't buy power for a higher rate than X unless the policy people tell me I have to do that. Then they needed to basically have a financing period to make sure that on an annual basis, the rate that was being charged the government to buy power was reasonable or fair or consistent with that particular term. And as you heard Brian talk about, there were a lot of different incentives. So hosting of energy facilities. So sometimes the land was free where it was located. There were federal incentives and those types of things, grants, direct purchase. And then the last piece was the federal purchase of power. And so what we did was we were approached by the Navy and we said, we need to come up with a better idea than this 10-year authority. I'll tell you the conclusion. They ended up utilizing and working through WAPA, which is listed here, Western Area Power Administration, where they can enter into contracts for up to 40 years in WAPA's district. And they do that through a unique agreement. Later on, DOD also said, you know what, we actually have this authority 2922A, 10 USC 2922A, that allows us to buy up to 30 years. So up until that point, the interpretation from the lawyers, yes, us lawyers get in the way all the time, was that it can only be used for specific types of projects, which did not include all these renewable projects. Eventually, the interpretation included these. So now they can enter into projects that are up to 30 years. And then the other option that they utilize all the time is appropriated funding. Every time there's going to be a project, though, what we do is we look at the potential options for entering into power purchase agreements. And the default is usually up to 10 years. That is the agreement that most federal agencies, including the Department of Energy and NNSA, et cetera, have with their local utility that they're buying power or utilities for between 5 and 10 years. And then, so when we look at these projects, especially when we're looking at advanced reactors, small modular reactors, and those types of things, we're trying to say to ourselves, okay, if the federal government, 1, agrees to buy the power, 2, agrees to pay the power for a certain price, and then 3, will they enter into a long-term agreement, more than 10 years? I know that they're looking at hoping for 30 or 40 years. Then what is our mechanism to do that? And remember, in order to get financing, as Brian said, you need to show that you have an off-taker, and that's where the federal power purchase comes in. The Atomic Energy Act, for those who are looking at DOE sites, has some unique authorities, and they've been utilized a couple of different times at Hanford and other places. And so, those are some of the things that we look at and try and figure out, and we've tried to identify. There's also ways of providing land, and then sometimes, especially with renewable projects, there's sometimes ways to do those renewable energy projects with energy savings performance contracts up to 25 years as part of the savings piece. And then with utility energy savings contracts, which also allow up to 25 years. And then the utility privatization is a unique DOD piece that DOE, I know, has looked at in the past, where a private party operates the utilities, where they could potentially utilize long-term authorities. WAPA I talked about, but you've got to just look the location of the facility, the uniqueness, the agency that you're working with. What are the different pieces and the tools that you have? So once again, when I look at these projects, this is usually the agreement. This is how the normal federal agency buys power. There's GSA has agreements with utilities all around the country, and they provide power for 5 to 10 years. DOE has negotiated rates that they enter into for 5 or 10 years. With TVA, there's a longer term agreement directly with TVA, because the TVA's unique authorities with the federal government. But those are the different ways. And it's usually this direct purchased. The utility on the other side, what the federal agency doesn't see, is the utility is buying power from existing power facilities, natural gas, coal. They have a mix, a lot of them of renewable, and then they also have nuclear in some. So hydro, etc. So that's the piece that you don't always see as you're going through. Now, here, I'm going to show you one of the SMR structures that we put together. I'm going to talk about this a little bit, and Brian's probably going to add a little bit more, since I always forget something when I'm talking about these. But what we're really looking at is the utility, and the utilities usually sometimes will purchase the power, and sometimes it's one utility, sometimes it's multiple utilities. They'll purchase the power from the SMR, and that SMR entity usually is a separate project ownership. They have tax ownership. They're trying to take advantage of the new IRA law that allows the nuclear power and renewable power, both, any clean energy projects, to take advantage of the tax credits and the direct cash payments for those particular projects. They're looking at particular financing. They're looking potentially at a loan guarantee program and how that works. Sometimes the project's on federal land, sometimes it isn't. And if it is, there's a lease or deed for those types of things. But that utility is selling directly to the federal agency, and they're looking for a long-term agreement. So there's a fixed entity that's going to purchase that power for a long time. Otherwise, the project owner, the party working on the SMR, is really looking at multiple utilities from purchasing it. And so I put together this structure because this is a structure that at least we know one entity is looking at, where there's a lot of different member utilities buying the power from the one particular project owner or developer. They're not a direct utility, but they are a utility that sells then to member utilities who all subscribe to the different pieces. And sometimes there's a federal agency agreement with the member utility, and then they sell to their retail customers also. Sometimes there could be an agreement with WAPA to have a longer term power purchase agreement, and a member utility and the federal agency is buying and entering into that agreement with WAPA. And as an example, I always like to give is Kirtland Air Force Base has an agreement where there is WAPA provides the power and wheels the power through other lines to Kirtland Air Force Base, Sandia, those types of things. And so WAPA plays that role already in some DOE sites as they're looking at it. And they do with different federal facility sites, like that Navy example, where WAPA entered into agreements with specific parties that were building renewable energy projects. The Navy agreed to buy all of that power, and WAPA is the party that's helping deliver the power to the Navy in that particular instance. Here, the financing would be the same. And Brian, before I go on, do you want to add anything to this?
I'm just curious, just looking at it, each of these, I guess, PPAs, they are paying for the delivery of the carbon-free power. Is that right? Like, in other words, they get the additionality of the SMR project. Okay. Do for each member utility, are they stepping up in this structure for essentially the same terms, or is there the opportunity to almost customize terms to each of those member utilities based on their, kind of unique circumstances?
Yeah, no, and that's a great point. They customize the terms, so they each agree to buy a different amount of power, just as they would with other, a natural gas facility or other types of facilities.
Mm-hmm.
So, go ahead. I mean, what we're trying to do here is just outline. I always look at it as, there's a simple process. The federal agency is buying power. So what you're trying to do is convince the federal agency that they need to enter into these other agreements and buy the power. So let me give an example. So, at one area, you may have Los Alamos National Laboratory. So buying from the utility from Los Alamos County entering into a power purchase agreement to buy the power, not only from the mix, but maybe even specifically from the SMR. So right now, that's what happens. The utility in Los Alamos County buys power from a natural gas facility. They have renewable assets, and they have other assets. And right now, Los Alamos National Laboratory is buying from them. They are also a subscriber potentially in, for example, the UAMPS project, where they would then agree to sell power to NNSA. And so NNSA, they'd be looking for NNSA to enter into an agreement between Los Alamos County Utility Department and NNSA to buy that additional power for, whether it's 10 years or a longer term. And then same somewhere else, and maybe that power is being purchased by the Hanford site or one of the other particular locations where a member utility executes the particular agreement. There's a power purchase agreement between the federal agency in that case. So you're looking at those different pieces as you're kind of going forward and trying to figure out how to put the different pieces together. Maybe a DOD facility that's buying the power from a member utility that's building one of these SMRs.
Maybe before we leave the slide, there's a question in the Q&A that I think we can at least partially address. When you look at the left-hand side of this diagram with the federal agency agreement, with entering into PPA with member utility, then we go down, you'll see like the DOE loan guarantee. And there's a question related to federal support and how much federal support can be on a particular project. And I'd say it's generally kind of project specific, but there is one concept to point out here where you have a federal agency as an off-taker that's entering into PPA. If those PPA payments are used to secure the repayment of a government loan, in this case, the DOE loan guarantee, that would sort of violate the support restrictions. And I think the principle behind that is that in the event the federal agency were to terminate the PPA, potentially for its convenience or otherwise, or for maybe a failure of Congress to appropriate, that failure would in turn lead to a default into the loan. And so the notion is that that you don't want to, tie the hands of Congress for future appropriations. And so when you see the presence of a federal loan, there's sort of a corresponding requirement that the revenues used to pay back the loan can't be subject to future federal appropriations. So it's a federal budgeting issue, but that is one of the layers of this federal support restriction that's in the Q&A. Now, a way around that would be, if you think of that project, think of it like a condominium, and you break it into 3 sub-projects. One of those sub-projects could generate revenues from the member utilities over on the right-hand side, and in turn, borrow, obtain a federal loan for that piece, that interest or capacity interest in the plant. So there are some workarounds. Obviously, this has never been done before with this SMR, but it's a good question to ask. There are some areas to navigate as it relates to how much federal support a particular project can get.
Go ahead, Brian. Why don't you take this one?
Sure. So we have a variety of tools or options on the left-hand side. I guess I'd say that what I've seen, particularly on the project development side. So for a period of time, I was advising the Army, and they were trying to develop projects on Army installations, and there's actually a fair amount of creativity needed and utilized to develop projects. And oftentimes it's installation specific. The 2922A authority is a pretty powerful authority. It gives the DOD the ability to enter into very long-term PPA, that that can basically be enough to anchor a project's development. Probably where I've seen the DOD struggle a little bit with is sort of by taking a long-term position in purchase power at a set price. They're also very aware of what's going on in the competitive market and sort of measure whether the PPA was a good idea based on where, say, wholesale markets are and whether and sometimes the alternative sources of power are higher and sometimes they're lower. But in terms of like managing a portfolio of power purchases, the PPA is actually, I think, a real good risk mitigant because it gives a very stable profile over time. I would say, though, that generally those projects are complicated to develop and go to market and then negotiate. And when we look at UESCs and ESPCs, enhanced use leases, these are, you just see a little bit more volume because I think they're a little bit easier to transact. And it's interesting how it's really the development community has been very creative at using these authorities to basically deliver projects on government installations. I think the WAPA transaction that the Navy undertook quite some time ago, I think, Seth, was very creative, probably set a precedent, and is an authority that can help work around some other areas that are other challenges. The one at the bottom, the conventional power buy, this, I think, Seth, if I'm right, this would be the 40 USC, the area wise, right?
Yep.
And the only thing I'd note on that is that's up to a 10-year authority. And I think in some of these projects, you actually see, it used to be like you couldn't do a renewable energy project if you without a 25-year PPA. But I think the market has, it's much shorter now, 15 years, 10 years. So there's some there's a comfort level emerging, at least in the renewable side, with with what we call a merchant tail, and that is after the PPA runs its term, the project is relatively confident it can still generate meaningful revenue by just selling into the merchant market. So we have seen PPA terms go down in terms of the number of years. You want me to start on this one, Seth?
Sure.
So I guess I would say from a federal agency issue that it's agencies are really serve the role as a project developer to identify locations, suitable locations, and shape a project. And that's both looking at the load profile, the site needs, and where the market is and whether the market can deliver something that's very competitive. Obviously, when we think about many federal installations, the importance of energy resilience is very, very high, and having I think having something on site can enhance resilience, but also you need the developer, the energy developer, to perform and deliver the project on time and operate it in a reliable fashion. Term of contract is always a key consideration. The longer the term, the more it's frankly harder because it's a long-term commitment, and having the expertise at the installation level to actually execute on agreements it can be a challenge because this is sort of a specialized area. So I think, if there's a procurement or contracting entity, I think that's done these kind of projects before. That's very helpful. How sites budget for these projects is a key consideration. Sometimes it's felt at the site level. So, entering to long-term contract will really fix an element of the site's budget. And then budget scoring, it's an area that's, I think, been a persistent challenge. I've always looked at it as from the perspective of the installation's going to purchase power regardless. And when they enter into a long-term agreement, it's the budget scoring sort of front loads those costs, which doesn't make a lot of sense. And I think it can be a real barrier. And
just on that one, so we need to separate out. So sometimes the federal agency will just provide the land, and it's an out lease, or a conveyance, and for an out lease, let's say, for example, if the federal government does an out lease and then agrees afterwards to purchase the power, then there'll be a budgetary scoring process or issue potentially on that particular project. And that's what most of the federal agencies have run into, and that's where they run into problems. The way that we've gotten around that a couple of different times is many of the federal agencies will go out for a service agreement. So they're going to say, we need to buy this particular power. And if you're going to be located on federal land, we'll provide you with a lease. But they're entering into a service agreement to get around budgetary scoring. And that's worked somewhat for the Department of Defense. The other way that I've seen this work is where they do an out lease. The project developer then agrees to sell the power to a local utility. And then that local utility separately has an agreement with the federal government to buy the power. And so they've also gotten around budgetary scoring on those particular issues. But that's a critical issue for the federal agency as it's going forward. And there are some solutions that have been successful out there, but each project, as Brian said, you've got to look at it carefully. And that's stopped dead in its tracks a lot of projects that we've worked on, because OMB, especially on the DOD side, is very in tune to these issues, because they've seen DOD kind of come through with a lot of different issues. The same thing pops up, in other contexts as well, but I just wanted to highlight that.
In terms of costs and the project economics, that's often looked at relative to alternative sources of supply. I think what we find the best thing to do is to really do a comprehensive life cycle cost analysis and run some sensitivities and see, how the project performs relative to sort of a baseline of power costs. Then, there is a process of clearing the land, so to speak, NEPA, the outgrant process, making sure if the project's located on an installation that it's that all the environmental work is done. The last one is, it's interesting. Big challenge, execute a contract prior to licensing for a first of a kind project. I think this is really where the policy mandate comes in, because I think the federal government, federal agencies are sort of uniquely well positioned to take on that kind of risk under the objective of advancing a stated policy goal. And then on the right hand is all the basically the same kind of challenges. I think the main takeaway is that we saw the slide earlier where there's a lot of solar and wind projects developed. Most nearly all of those were not federal. federal purchases and federal PPAs of clean energy projects, I'd say remain sort of a one-off process. And that's as much to do with some of the complexities of working on federal sites, but it's also it sort of reflects a bit of fragmentation, sort of the purchasing of power at the federal level. It's agency specific, site specific, and I think a lot of what we've done is really try to bring precedent transactions and talk to contracting officers of where some projects and some things have been done before and how that it can apply to a project that is being considered.
So when we just set out a lot of the different issues, and we get a lot of those questions, and we've had to answer those questions. But I think really when we look at it is, how is the administration, there are executive orders on purchasing carbon-free and clean energy that are being mandated down to the federal agencies. So then in the leadership of those federal agencies, what are they doing to implement the policies that are set at the administration level? And then once you get past the secretary level, what are each of the land holding agencies that are responsible for buying utilities? What are they doing as you go forward? And I think, for example, at the Department of Energy, each of the offices have come up with their plans. Now they have to implement those plans as they're going forward. The other thing I would tell you is, something that we always kind of look at, and we always joke around that, that there's different offices, or we call those different silos. And so maybe that the nuclear energy office is really focused on SMRs, but how do you then get NNSA or EM or other offices to then say, this is our priority? And the only way you do that is by the secretary or deputy secretary making sure that the leadership of those offices understand what their priorities are. And so is it buying from a nuclear power plant? Is it buying renewable energy? What is it, and how are they going to implement it? And then across the other federal agencies, the same thing. Those are all critical issues as you're going forward. So when we look at this and we look at the policy decisions, the legal authorities, and the financial incentives, we talked about the packaging and trying to put the whole package together. A big part of it is what's happening on the policy level. Then do they have the authority, and how do you implement it? And then, finally, the financial incentives. We're talking about these legal authorities now in between. The other thing is, we talked about the executive order, but now it's implementing those particular issues. We talked about budgetary scoring. We talked about clarity of legal, and then we talked about financial needs. And so a lot of the discussion is, what are they going to purchase, for example, on an SMR? What is the value that the federal government can purchase the power as well at? I'm trying to run through this to make sure we have a lot more time for discussion. But once again, so here's all these different authorities. Always remember WAPA and the other power marketing authorities. Always remember special legislation as well. And what we recommended is that there be a change, and that we authorize, GSA has asked for this many times over the years, to get 30 to 40 year authority to enter into clean energy agreements. They haven't been able to get it through Congress because of Congressional Budget Office scoring. So that's one piece. The other thing, enable current authorities to execute virtual PPAs. We're not going to go into detail. At the end, when we provide you with these slides, we'll talk about virtual PPAs, but that's how Google, Facebook, Ford, all the large companies in the United States, they enter into these virtual PPAs where the delivery of the electrons are not direct, but they're agreeing to buy power, they're agreeing to buy renewable or clean power somewhere else in return for them being treated as if they are buying the power purchase agreement. And then there's unique contractual risks and authorities that we won't get into here. And then finally, enable federal agencies to authorize their own PPAs as well. Right now, most don't have the authority. They have to go through GSA. DOD and GSA have been delegated the authority. So the proposals on the legislative side to date, David Reeploeg would have killed me if I didn't go through this. One is GSA asking for the 30-year authority. That is, Congress being able to accept the scoring for that to occur. Right now, at 10 years, CBO and OMB have agreed not to score a 10-year power purchase agreement for the agency, which means their annual payments for utilities are treated as annual payments. They're not treated as, when they sign the agreement, they're not scored or have to pay for that full 10 years up front. That'll be the same thing with the 30-year authority. And that's what DOD has been able to do with its 10 USC 2922A authority. That's why one of the other options that we've talked about is having DOE because most of them are defense nuclear facilities, asking for the same authority as DOD. That way the budgetary scoring impact would be much smaller. And so DOE and NNSA would be able to enter into that longer term authority. But that only works if the agency is willing to push the policy issues on that. So with that, we'll turn it back to David. And these are the questions that we tried to highlight at the beginning, and hopefully we answered some of them.
Yeah, that was great. Thank you, Seth and Brian. I think that was a really good overview. And I think we have about 15 minutes left for questions, and appreciate you, Seth, addressing one of my questions that I was planning on asking. I probably have a couple more, but first I'll ask some of the questions that were submitted through the Q&A, kind of in order that they were received. So the first question that was asked, and Brian did a good job of addressing one of them, but another question that was asked is, are there standard terms for federal power purchase agreements? I think that was somewhat addressed, but just want to make sure we catch that.
Yeah, I would say standard terms, it's sort of. I mean, they're like the 2922As, there was a template agreement, and there were several transactions that were structured off that. So, I think each transaction is a little bit different and will have some unique terms, but generally fairly standard. And I'd say in all cases, there's generally a standard risk profile of what the private developer and the financiers are willing to do. And so kind of the rules of the game are fairly well understood. Seth, do you probably like?
Of course, I don't agree with Brian here, but so I'm the one who gets to negotiate these agreements, either for a federal agency or for a developer or lender as they're going through. Every military service has their own separate agreement, so there is a standardization within those particular services, but they're all a little bit different. I will tell you, DOE is very different than those military services. And I will tell you, GSA has a standard agreement. And that is the only one that is standard. I will tell you, one of the most critical things, especially for these long-term agreements, is the rights of the debt holders and the financiers and being able to meet those requirements. And a lot of them basically deal with, look, if the developer is failing at its job, the lender or developer or the financier wants to make sure that it can recoup its money. So it wants to either bring in a replacement developer or wants to ensure that the project goes forward or walk away from the project with the investment that's occurred at the time. That is probably one of the biggest negotiations that we have as we're going forward. The other pieces that we are always negotiating, are the term, the prices, all those other types of things, because the contracting officers, especially those that do utility agreements or real estate agreements, they're very different. So when you're dealing with these different parties, especially where things are tied together, you need to take all of those different pieces into account.
Let me ask you a follow-up. Do you see the developers and financiers accepting sort of a different risk profile across projects, or is their position on certain risks pretty well firmed and standardized?
So what's interesting is it depends, because so if the financier's at the table, the risk profile is very standardized. But what I find a lot of times is the developer will negotiate something just to be able to get, especially those that are doing only the development side, and they're not the ones who actually have to install and construct the project and finance it. This happens more on the renewable side. They'll sign almost anything in order to get the rights. And then when they bring the lender in, they'll try to renegotiate the deal in order to move the project forward.
So another good question that was asked, it was specific to TVA, but I think it could be expanded to BPA and some of the other federal power marketing administrations too. But the question was, can TVA be taking advantage of these things for their SMRs?
Yeah, definitely. We actually, our second book that we wrote for the Department of Energy looked at TVA installing an SMR. What's great is, so TVA now gets to take advantage of the tax credit under the IRA for SMRs. They could get a cash benefit payment out of it, whereas before that they couldn't. So that's a huge incentive. The other piece is they actually have unique authorities that allow them to enter into longer term agreements that a private sector developer wouldn't have with the Department of Energy. Or with federal agencies. So they actually have a longer period. I forgot exactly what it is, over 20 years. Those are types of things that TVA has that's unique, that they can take advantage of based on their particular level. And Brian, I don't know if you have anything else to add.
No, I think that's, I remember we were talking about that some years ago with TVA.
Well, and then maybe to expand on that, so you mentioned, Seth, that TVA has some unique authorities, at least for us here in the Pacific Northwest, where BPA is the big federal power marketing administration. And I think that the Hanford site purchases their power, at least some of it, directly from BPA. So if you're either served by BPA or some of the other federal power marketing administrations, you were showing that model earlier of kind of how and where the PPA would connect in with a new project development. Where for those other federal power marketing administrations would this fit in, and would you have kind of the same authority that TVA has, or would it have to look different?
So what's interesting is they all have unique authorities between them all. As I said, WAPA actually has the up to 40-year authority, where TVA is 20 or 25. I forgot exactly what term it is. And they all have different agreements with how they enter into agreements with federal agencies. I think WAPA is the most flexible, but I also think that's because WAPA's general counsel looked at certain things in certain ways. So there may be tweaks to the authorities that may be done for some of the other power marketing, but I don't think Brian and I have ever looked at each power marketing entity and made a determination based on each one. I do know they're all different though.
Okay. Another question. So who is holding the RECs and who is holding the REC value, the renewable energy credit value?
It depends on the negotiation. Most of the time, the federal agency wants to do that, but at the same time, the federal agency is going to want to monetize it to the extent that it can be monetized, because that means lower pricing for the federal agency. So I've really seen both. As we're working on these projects, and I've seen it evolve over time. But if there's more value, the federal agency is going to want the private party to monetize that.
Yeah, it's and that I think that's sort of evolving a little bit. I know in corporate purchasers really want the additionality associated with the project that they're buying from, so they may take the RECs, but as Seth said, it's often the case where the developer will keep the REC value, monetize it, and in turn lower the PPA price, and they maybe provide replacement RECs to the federal agency, and they'll buy those on the cheap somewhere else. But I think that's evolving a little bit in terms of claims of meeting targets. It's I feel like the bar is going up a little bit, at least in the corporate side, in terms of real additionality of almost like that sort of the but-for test. That project would not happen but for the fact that I'm buying the power.
I think we have time at least for a couple more questions. One other question that came in was, are there any advantages to the carbon-free power project being on land DOE accesses to the community versus leases to the utility or the owner?
Yeah, I mean, so there's different ways, as we talked about. There's a scoring issue potentially when you've got leased land. When you have conveyed land, I think then you don't have to worry about any of those particular issues popping up in the future. But there's also, you got to also remember there's a process between a lease and a deed, and what that takes as you're kind of going forward also. So there's you have to look at everything very specifically about whether it works better for the particular project or not. There it may impact licensing also. I haven't looked at that issue for that particular project. So you got to look at all those. We always put together lists of benefits or not. Typically, most developers would prefer to have the land conveyed because there's a lot less restrictions. There's a lot less, I'll call it, this, I'll make it clean, pain in the butt type issues that come up.
Another really good question that was asked, and I might expand on it a little bit too, but the question was, how are ancillary benefits such as resilience valued? And again, to kind of expand on that, especially we know that the DOD has really placed a value on resilience at their facilities, but as we bring more and more renewables online, I think a lot of folks are forecasting that the cost of firm 24/7 available clean power is only going to increase in the years to come. And that can sometimes create a challenge. And so as we're sort of trying to make the case for expanding these PPA authorities for longer periods of time, are folks talking about that additional value that may not necessarily be reflected in the cost per kilowatt hour, but in the ability to provide that 24/7 clean power that otherwise may not be available?
Yeah. I mean, it's a great question. I think it's valued, but I think it's really challenging to put a dollar. You're really starting with something that's sort of not valued today, or not. So when you add the project, and let's just say the project's more costly, but it's truly resilient. Behind the meter, grid goes down, you stay up. Usually that's pretty expensive, and I think the way to justify is say, hey, this is, here's the cost to us if our source of power goes down, if we go down. So a good example, like a hospital. There's no question that a hospital needs to be able to serve its loads 24/7. So they will, pay for backup gensets and that kind of stuff. I think, it's worth looking at and trying to value, but it's usually, I think some of it's like you're really insuring against a low probability, high impact event, and it's one of those things you really value when the power's out, you know what I mean? And some of the ways you can value it is there's like black start capability, those kinds of things that you can place a value. I think we tried this, Seth, in one of our NE reports a few years back. If I remember correctly, it's you're really you're incurring a cost for something that's very low probability, and for that reason, it's hard to make it pencil purely financially. I think you really have to have a decision. We need resiliency, and you see that with DOD. Of course, you see it with like hospitals, and the fact that grid outages are a more frequent occurrence is also, I think, presenting or showing what the cost of not being up is. So there's more data out there that should help in valuing projects like that.
Yeah, the only thing I'm gonna add is what we're seeing and what we've seen over the last couple of years is federal agencies will basically identify what the resilience benefit is from almost every single one of these projects that's built, especially when they're built on those facilities, because there is a value for the mission for that. And then they're also looking at, especially for national defense facilities, the critical aspect, as Brian said. So you've got all these backup diesel generators what else can you do in order to make these projects work? So, and then our second study, I think, Brian, you did his analysis kind of came up with potentially how to value those types of things. And that included an analysis of TVA. And I think what they were looking at was potentially specific facilities for NNSA and providing direct power through an SMR in Oak Ridge. So I think that's what that study looked at.
So I see that we're more or less at time, but I'm going to maybe take moderator's prerogative and ask one final question to both of you. If you have any advice or suggestions for whether it's ECA members or any others who are interested in kind of moving this conversation forward and working to expand federal authorities for these PPAs, what do you suggest that we do?
I'll say two things. One, and this is one of my pet peeves, is making sure that the leadership of whatever agency that you're working with who would be buying the power actually supports the project and buying the power, and that it's really clear to all levels who are doing the purchasing. So it makes it to the contracting officer also that is their job to help support this. And then secondly, we talked about the legislative pieces. It's giving that additional authority if the authority doesn't already exist. So the authority, especially DOE, has some unique authorities, and you need to look at all of those. But once again, the only way that they're going to be used is if the leadership says this is important to us, and that is really what the ECA communities can help really push on, is to make sure it's not just a priority for NE, but it's a priority for whatever office is located at your facility.
And I guess I would add, be a project champion. I think you need the leadership, and there's somebody local that's thinking about the project every day and moving it forward bit by bit. I think, these projects take a while, and having a champion is absolutely essential.
Great. Well, thanks to you both. I just remind our audience that I believe Dylan put the slides in the chat. So if you wanted to go back and take a look at any of the slides, they're available. You can always contact any member of the ECA team if you have any follow-up questions or need those slides. But again, Brian, Seth, thanks very much for your participation today. A lot of really great information shared, and thanks to the ECA team for helping to make this happen. Hope everyone has a great rest of your day.
Thanks, David. Bye.
Thank you.